The aircraft was 6 hours from the most critical defense flight in Skyforge Dynamics history, and someone had already decided it would never succeed. A contract technician named Adrian Cross found the proof buried inside a system nobody else even knew existed. He brought it straight to the CEO, and she laughed at him. She told him to get away from her aircraft, threatened his career, and had security escort him out of the hangar. 40 minutes later, the Pentagon called, and the entire building went silent. If this kind of story hits different for you, subscribe. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this one travels, and don't miss what's coming next. The hangar at Skyforge Dynamics didn't sleep. It breathed, a low mechanical respiration of hydraulic lifts, ventilation ducts, and the occasional metallic clang that echoed off walls tall enough to fit a small apartment building inside. At 4:47 in the morning, the lights burned at full capacity and had been burning that way since midnight, because Victoria Hale had made it very clear to every department head, every crew chief, and every contracted technician on site that Condor 1 would be wheels up by 1100 hours, and she didn't care what it took to get there. The aircraft itself sat on the primary staging platform at the center of the hangar, framed by scaffolding and service gantries like something between a cathedral and a machine. It was a modified long-range transport, military specifications beneath a civilian airframe, its belly lined with communication arrays that most Skyforge engineers had never been cleared to look at. The Department of Defense had contracted Skyforge 18 months ago to build and certify the platform for a classified logistics operation, and the flight today wasn't a test run. It was the real thing. Dignitaries, hardware, and operational personnel, all of it moving under a security classification that nobody in the hangar was supposed to discuss by name. Victoria knew the stakes. She'd built her career on knowing the stakes and performing flawlessly inside them. Adrian Cross knew the stakes too. He just wasn't supposed to be there anymore. He'd arrived at 3:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before his shift technically began, because that was the kind of man he was. Not eager, exactly, more like constitutionally incapable of showing up unprepared. He was 41, medium height, the kind of lean that comes from forgetting to eat rather than from any particular discipline about it. He'd been contracting with Skyforge for 11 weeks on a specific, narrow assignment: legacy system verification on Condor 1's pressure architecture and the encrypted communication backbone that ran underneath it. Legacy was a polite word for it. The communication security layer built into Condor 1's backbone was a proprietary military encryption framework called Eris 7, designed over a decade ago, never fully publicized, and maintained by exactly 3 civilian contractors in the country who'd been cleared to work on it. Adrian had been one of the original design team. The other 2 had retired, which made him functionally the only person outside the government who understood how that system was supposed to behave. He hadn't told anyone that when he took the contract. It wasn't the kind of thing you led with. What he did instead was show up quietly, do his work, and keep his logs meticulous. He had a small, half-repaired laptop he carried everywhere in a canvas bag that had a broken zipper on the outside pocket, and he filled that laptop with notes the way other people fill notebooks, obsessively, specifically, every anomaly logged with a timestamp and a cross-reference. That morning, he found something he hadn't been looking for. He was running a routine baseline check on the pressurization feedback loop, a standard pre-flight verification that should have produced a clean result. When the diagnostic returned a configuration signature he didn't recognize. It wasn't an error code. It wasn't a fault flag. It was a parameter value sitting inside a range that looked normal unless you knew what the original specification called for. And the original specification was something Adrian had helped write. He stared at the readout for a long moment. Then he ran it again. Same result. Then he pulled up the maintenance logs to trace when the parameter had changed, and that's when things got worse. The log showed no modification. According to the official record, the parameter had always been at the value he was seeing now. But Adrian had the baseline documentation from the original build in his files, and it didn't match. Someone had changed the value and then changed the log to match. He sat in the small diagnostics alcove off the main staging floor. A narrow, fluorescent-lit space with 2 monitors and a rolling chair that leaned slightly to the left, and worked backward through every record he could access for the next hour and 20 minutes. He wasn't panicking. That wasn't his mode. He was methodical, because that was what the situation required. And the more methodical he was, the more certain he became that this was not a minor discrepancy. The pressurization fault alone was serious. At altitude, the misconfiguration would cause a gradual failure in the cabin pressure maintenance cycle, slow enough to be subtle, fast enough to become catastrophic in the window between 28,000 and 35,000 feet. But the pressurization issue wasn't even the part that made his jaw tighten. The Ares 7 communication layer had been touched. He could see it in the system timestamps if you knew how to read them, and almost nobody did. A secondary authentication key had been rotated out of sequence, which under normal circumstances would simply disable secure communication capability. But Ares 7 had a failsafe behavior when its authentication fell out of sequence during an active classified operation. It would broadcast a partial decryption packet to any receiver within range before shutting down. The system's designers had built that in as an emergency handshake for military recovery operations. In the wrong context, it was an intelligence leak dressed up as a safety feature. Adrian sat in that alcove and thought about it carefully, because he didn't want to be wrong. He didn't want to be the contractor who disrupted a high-stakes government operation because he misread a diagnostic. He went through everything twice more. He cross-referenced against his documentation. He was not wrong. He picked up his bag, walked out onto the main floor, and asked one of the crew chiefs where he could find someone from Skyforge leadership. He found Nathan Briggs first, Victoria's operations chief, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with the kind of permanent squint that came from too many years standing near aircraft engines. Nathan was at the far end of the hangar with two engineers reviewing something on a tablet, and he didn't look up when Adrian approached. "Mr. Briggs," Adrian said, "I need to report a systems anomaly. Both the pressurization feedback loop and the ARS communication layer are showing configurations that don't match the original build spec, and the maintenance logs have been altered to conceal it." Nathan looked up then. His expression didn't change. "Who are you?" "Adrian Cross. Contract Tech, Legacy Systems. I've been on the Ares 7 baseline since week 1. Nathan looked at him for a moment with the kind of look that carries its own particular message, the one that says you're smaller than you think you are. "I know who you are. The logs were reviewed by my team last night and signed off. Whatever you think you found, you didn't find it. I can show you the discrepancy. I have the original. We are 6 hours from departure on a classified federal operation," Nathan said, his voice dropping low in the way that men use when they want to make something sound final. "This aircraft has been certified. If you have a concern, you file it through the proper channel with your contracting supervisor. Don't walk up to me on the floor like you run something here." He turned back to his tablet. "We're done." Adrian stood there for a second. Then he said, "With respect, Mr. Briggs, I'm going to need to escalate this." Nathan didn't look up again. "You do whatever you feel like you have to do." Victoria Hale had a temporary office set up in the mezzanine level above the hangar floor. A glass-walled space with a standing desk, 3 monitors, and a view that let her look down at the entire operation like a conductor watching an orchestra. She'd been awake for 22 hours, and it didn't particularly show, which was one of her skills. She wore it like a kind of armor, the composure, the pressed jacket, the way she carried herself through exhaustion, as though fatigue was something that happened to other people. She was on the phone when her assistant knocked and entered to tell her there was a contract technician asking to see her. Victoria was not the kind of person who had unscheduled conversations with contract technicians the morning of a critical flight. She told her assistant to have him go through proper channels. The assistant came back 2 minutes later. He was still there. He said it was about the aircraft's safety systems. Victoria ended her call. She came down the mezzanine stairs with 3 of her senior executives behind her, not because she'd asked them to follow, but because they could read a shift in her energy, and none of them wanted to be the one who wasn't in the room. She crossed the hangar floor and found Adrian Cross standing near the diagnostics alcove with his canvas bag over one shoulder and what she would later describe to someone as the most irritating calm she'd ever seen on a contractor. "Tell me," she said, and her tone was the kind that means I'm giving you 30 seconds. Adrian told her. He kept it specific and kept it short because he understood the situation. He explained the pressurization parameter discrepancy, the Ares 7 authentication rotation, the altered timestamps in the maintenance log. He held up his laptop and showed her the baseline documentation versus what the current system was showing. Victoria listened. Then she turned to Nathan Briggs, who had appeared at some point during the explanation and was standing slightly behind her left shoulder. "Nathan," she said, "this is the system you signed off on?" "It is," Nathan said. "Those baseline documents he's showing you are from an early design iteration. The spec was updated during the integration phase. What he's reading as a discrepancy is actually the final certified configuration." Victoria looked back at Adrian. "There you go." "That's not accurate," Adrian said. "I was part of the Ares 7 design team. The configuration I'm describing is not a design iteration. It's a modification to the final certified build." One of the executives shifted his weight. Nathan's jaw tightened, barely visible. Victoria took a step closer to Adrian, and when she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The hangar was large enough that people nearby had stopped moving. "Let me be clear with you," she said. "You are a contract technician brought in for a defined scope of work. You are not a systems engineer. You are not a flight authority. You are not a federal official. My operations chief, who has been with this company for 11 years and who personally oversaw the integration of every system on that aircraft, has told me your read is wrong. My certified maintenance team signed off on this aircraft last night, and you are standing here 3 hours before I need this hangar quiet, telling me that every one of them missed something that you alone caught this morning?" She paused. "Do you understand how that sounds?" "I do," Adrian said. "I'd still like you to ground the aircraft." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and then something shifted in her expression. Not anger exactly, more like a door closing. "You are done on this contract as of right now. Your access badge is suspended. If you touch anything else on this aircraft, I will make sure every aerospace contractor in this industry knows your name for the wrong reasons." She turned to the security supervisor standing nearby. "Please escort Mr. Cross to the exit." The security supervisor stepped forward. Nathan Briggs watched Adrian go with a steady, unreadable expression. Adrian didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He picked up his canvas bag, walked beside the security supervisor across the floor, and didn't look back. What nobody noticed, because they were all watching Victoria walk back toward the mezzanine stairs with her executives trailing behind her, was that Adrian Cross pulled out his phone the moment he stepped through the side door, scrolled to a number he hadn't called in 4 years, and started typing. 43 minutes later, Victoria Hale's direct line rang. The number on the screen was a Washington, D.C. area code with a prefix her assistant recognized immediately. She answered on the second ring. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Her assistant, who was in the room, later said she had never seen Victoria Hale lose color like that. Not visibly, not dramatically, just a gradual, quiet draining, like something being turned off slowly from the inside. When she hung up, she stood still for a moment. Then she looked at her assistant and said with remarkable steadiness, "Fine, Nathan. Tell him to stop whatever he's doing. Tell him to stop everything." She moved toward the door. "And find the technician you escorted out. Bring him back in." Down on the hangar floor, the work had continued as though nothing had changed. Crew chiefs moving with purpose. Gantry crews running final checks. The aircraft sitting in the center of it all, gleaming under the overhead lights, enormous and expensive, and, unknown to everyone still working around it, broken in ways that could not be seen from the outside. Nathan Briggs had his phone to his ear. He was standing in a corner near the hydraulic service bay, speaking quietly, and whoever he was talking to was not someone whose name he'd want on a call log. He ended the call when he saw the assistant coming toward him. His face didn't change, but his hand, for just a moment, pressed flat against the side of his leg. The small, reflexive gesture of a man who has just realized that something he thought he controlled has started to move on its own. Victoria was already at the bottom of the mezzanine stairs when Adrian Cross was walked back through the side door by the same security supervisor who'd escorted him out. She crossed the floor toward him. The executives who'd been with her earlier had scattered, gone to make calls or find somewhere to stand that wasn't directly in the center of what was about to happen. Adrian stopped walking, waited. "That was the Pentagon," Victoria said. She said it the way you say something you're still processing. Apparently your clearance level on the Eris 7 architecture is... She paused. They were very specific about what I am and am not allowed to do here. I know, Adrian said. They want you to begin a full diagnostic, under federal authority. I know that too. She held his gaze. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite anything yet. Not apology, not embarrassment, more like the first moment of understanding that a situation is larger than the frame you put around it. You could have told me about the clearance, she said. You didn't ask, he said. You told me to leave. She didn't have an answer for that. Neither of them spoke for a moment. What do you need to start? She asked. Adrian set his canvas bag down on a nearby equipment cart. He pulled out his laptop. Full access to the maintenance log archive, direct line to your systems integration team, and I need Nathan Briggs kept away from the aircraft. Victoria looked at him steadily. Nathan's been with me for 11 years. I know, Adrian said. That's why. He opened his laptop and started working. Nathan Briggs did not go home. That was the first thing Victoria noticed when she asked her assistant to confirm his location 20 minutes after her conversation with Adrian. Nathan was still in the building, down on the floor near the hydraulic service bay, moving between crew stations with his tablet under his arm and his phone out, talking to people in the low, efficient way he always did when he wanted to look like he was managing something instead of managing something else entirely. She watched him from the mezzanine for a moment. 11 years. She kept returning to that number the way you press on a bruise, not because you want to feel it, but because some part of you needs to confirm it's real. She turned away from the window and went back to her desk. Now, Adrian had commandeered the diagnostics alcove. The rolling chair that leaned to the left had been pushed into the corner, replaced by a second monitor that a technician had wheeled in without being asked. Adrian had simply looked at the single-screen setup, looked at the technician, and the technician had understood. His laptop was open beside the monitor, connected by a cable to the aircraft's ground diagnostic port, and he had a yellow legal pad on the desk to his right, where he was writing things by hand in a cramped left-leaning script that was nearly illegible to anyone but him. Marcy Velt, Skyforge's head of systems integration, a compact woman in her late 30s with close-cut hair and the habit of crossing her arms not out of defensiveness, but because she was always slightly cold, had been assigned to work with him. She stood near the entrance of the alcove with her own tablet, watching him work with the expression of someone who hasn't yet decided whether they're witnessing competence or a performance of it. What exactly are we looking for? She asked. Right now, I'm mapping the timeline of every log entry that touched the pressurization subsystem in the last 3 weeks. Adrian didn't look up from the screen. I want to see when entries were written versus when the system says the corresponding maintenance action occurred. Those should be the same. They should be. Hand me that secondary cable, the gray one. She handed it over. If the logs were altered, wouldn't the system catch the modification? Not if the modification was made by someone with administrative access to the logging architecture. He plugged the cable in. The system records what it's told to record. If you have the right credentials, you can write a log entry for an event that happened yesterday and timestamp it for last Tuesday, and the system accepts it. It doesn't verify against anything external. Marcy was quiet for a moment. And you think someone did that? I know someone did that. I'm trying to find the thread. She shifted her weight. Nathan's team had admin access to the logging system during the integration phase. Adrian wrote something on his legal pad. Who specifically? Nathan and 2 of his direct reports, Soren Hatch and Dale Rizzo. Are they here today? Soren is. Dale called in sick this morning. Adrian looked up then, briefly. When did he call in? Marcy checked her tablet. Log says 3:40 a.m. Before my shift started, Adrian said. He looked back at the screen. Get me Dale Rizzo's access log for the past 3 weeks. Wow. The crew on the main floor had been told there was a technical review in progress. No further detail was given, which was the kind of non-explanation that travels through a workforce like static electricity, fast, invisible, and slightly uncomfortable. People kept working because the work was there, and because stopping felt worse than continuing, but the conversations had shifted. They were quieter. The kind of quiet that means people are thinking things they haven't decided to say yet. One of the fueling technicians, a man named Ray Kowalski, who'd been with Skyforge for 6 years and had worked on 7 DoD contracts, was rechecking a coupling he'd already checked twice when the guy beside him, a newer hire named Teo, asked what was going on with the contract tech in the alcove. "Don't know," Ray said. "Nathan looked pissed when they brought him back in. Nathan always looks like that. Not like this." Teo lowered his voice. "You think they found something wrong with the bird?" Ray didn't answer immediately. He finished checking the coupling and straightened up. "If they found something wrong with the bird," he said carefully, "I'm real glad someone's looking at it before we put people on it." Teo nodded slowly. Neither of them said anything else, but Ray didn't move on to the next task right away. He stood there for a second, looking at the aircraft. "What?" Nathan Briggs found Soren Hatch near the rear equipment station. A tall, angular man in his early 40s who operated with the precise efficiency of someone who'd been trained never to waste motion. Soren had worked under Nathan for 8 years. He was good at his job in the way that made you stop noticing he was good at it, which was exactly the quality Nathan had valued most about him. Nathan didn't approach directly. He came around the backside of the equipment station as if he was reviewing something on his own tablet. And when he stopped next to Soren, he kept his eyes on the tablet and his voice low enough to disappear under the ambient noise of the hangar. "The review they're running," Nathan said. "How much of the integration documentation did you personally file under your credentials versus mine?" Soren didn't flinch, but a very small muscle near his jaw tightened. "Most of the subsystem logs came through my credentials. You told me to consolidate the filing to reduce the audit trail." "I know what I told you." Nathan turned a page on his tablet as though reading it. "If they pull your access log and see entries at 2 and 3 in the morning on the 15th and 16th, what does that look like?" Soren said nothing for a moment. "It looks like what it is." What it looks like and what it is are two different things. "Nathan," Soren's voice was barely above a murmur, "what did you tell me those modifications were for? You said they were spec updates approved during the integration review. You showed me a document." "Keep your voice down." "Was there a document?" Nathan looked up from his tablet and met Soren's eyes for the first time since he'd walked over. His expression was completely neutral in the way that men practice in mirrors. "There was documentation. The question is whether the documentation is still accessible, and I'm telling you that some of it may have been part of a superseded file set that got archived." Soren stared at him. "I made those entries because you told me they were authorized. And I'm telling you to stay calm and let me handle this." "Who's the guy in the alcove?" "Nobody important." "He came back in with a Pentagon authorization. That's not nobody." Nathan's jaw moved slightly. "I said I'll handle it. You don't need to talk to anyone. If someone from the review comes to you, you tell them you followed protocol. You tell them everything was authorized by your superior, and you refer them to me. That's it." Soren looked at him for a long moment with an expression that had shifted from uncertainty into something quieter and harder to name. "Okay," he said. "Not agreement exactly. More like a man buying himself time to think." Nathan walked away without another word. Mess. The access log for Dale Rizzo took 40 minutes to pull and cross-reference, partly because the retrieval required 2 authorization layers that Marcy had to work through separately, and partly because the picture that emerged from the data was complicated enough that Adrian went through it twice before saying anything. What the log showed was a series of access events spread across 9 days, always between 1:30 and 4 o'clock in the morning, always using a credential set that carried Nathan's administrator permissions, but appeared to have been operated under Soren Hatch's login. There were 41 distinct entries. 37 of them had timestamps that, when cross-referenced against the physical work orders for those periods, could not have occurred when they were recorded. The maintenance actions they documented were listed as completed before the relevant personnel were even on site. "Someone was backdating," Marcy said. She had stopped crossing her arms somewhere in the last 20 minutes. Now she was leaning over Adrian's shoulder with both hands flat on the desk. "Someone was backdating," Adrian confirmed, "and they were careful about it. They didn't change every entry, just the ones that touched the pressurization feedback calibration and the ARIS-7 parameter set. Everything else in the log is clean." "Which means they knew exactly what they were modifying." "Which means they knew exactly what they were modifying." He scrolled back up. The changes to the Eris 7 authentication key happened on the night of the 22nd and the morning of the 23rd. The pressurization parameter got pushed 4 days later. Two separate events, but they're connected. The pressurization fault would create a diagnostic alert that the crew would respond to, and in responding to it, they'd trigger the Eris communication failsafe. Marcy straightened up. The failsafe that broadcasts a decryption packet. During an active classified operation, within range of anyone positioned to receive it. Adrian looked at the screen. This isn't vandalism, it was designed. The words sat in the space between them for a moment. Designed to do what? Marcy asked. Take out the aircraft? No. If you wanted to take out the aircraft, you'd do it differently, thus something faster, something less traceable. This was designed to make the mission fail. And when the mission fails on a DoD contract, the contract review process starts. Skyforge's certification gets pulled pending investigation. The company's stock drops. He closed the log window and opened a second screen. Someone wanted to put Skyforge in a position where it looked like a security and safety failure at the same time. That kind of double exposure doesn't just damage a contract. It makes the whole company vulnerable. Marcy was quiet. Then she said, vulnerable to what? Acquisition, Adrian said, at a price nobody would be paying 6 months ago. She looked at him. You think someone is trying to buy Skyforge? I think someone already has the money ready. He picked up his phone. I need to make a call. Can you give me 10 minutes in here alone? She nodded and walked out without asking who he was calling. Victoria was on her way down from the mezzanine when Marcy intercepted her at the bottom of the stairs. Marcy was not the kind of person who stopped people on staircases. She was organized, she scheduled things, she used the proper channels. So when she stepped in front of Victoria with a particular look on her face, Victoria stopped walking. He found something, Marcy said. Tell me. The log tampering is documented, access events backdated, timestamps that don't match physical work orders, modification pattern that targets specific systems. She paused. And it's not random. He thinks the sabotage was designed to trigger a mission failure that would compromise Skyforge's DoD standing, to devalue the company. Victoria said nothing for a moment. Her face did what it had done on the phone with the Pentagon. That slow, quiet draining. He said, acquisition, Marcy added. Someone moving to buy the company while the value is down. Who has the access trail? Soren Hatch's credentials, Nathan's admin permissions. Victoria closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. Where is Nathan right now? Last I saw, he was near the rear equipment station. Find him. Don't tell him anything. Just make sure someone knows where he is. She moved past Marcy toward the alcove. And I want a security lead posted at every external data port on that aircraft. Shut. Adrian was still on the phone when Victoria appeared at the entrance to the alcove. He held up one finger without looking at her, the gesture of someone in the middle of a sentence they can't interrupt, and she waited, which she was not accustomed to doing. Yes, both. I'll have the access log compiled by 0800 your time. He listened. No, the aircraft hasn't been cleared yet. We're still in the middle of the diagnostic. Another pause. I understand. I'll keep you updated. He ended the call and looked at Victoria. Pentagon? She asked. Their oversight contact. He set the phone down. They're sending a federal technician to assist with the ARS-7 restoration once we've completed the diagnostic, but they want a full incident documentation package before anyone touches the physical system. How long does that take? Depends on what else I find. He looked back at his screen. Sit down if you want. This is going to be a real conversation. She pulled over a chair, not the leaning one, the straight one from near the door, and sat. He walked her through what he'd found. He didn't simplify it, but he didn't perform expertise either. He talked the way someone talks when they're explaining something they know well to someone they're treating as capable of understanding it, and Victoria followed without interrupting, which surprised him slightly. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You're telling me someone inside this company has been planning this long enough to set up an acquisition play? She said. The modifications weren't made overnight. The preparation, getting the right credentials, knowing which parameters to change, Understanding how the failsafe would behave, that's months of groundwork. Nathan has been with me for 11 years, she said again. It came out differently this time. Not defensive, more like she was trying to understand the arithmetic of it. I know, Adrian said. People who are trusted for a long time have a lot of access. That's not a coincidence. It's the point. Victoria looked at the screen where the access log was still displayed. He would have known your scope when you were brought on. He would have known what you had clearance to access. Yes. He signed off on limiting your system access during the integration review. I approved it based on his recommendation. She said it flatly. He kept you out of the systems you would have found this in. I know that too. Adrian turned back to his laptop. But he didn't account for the baseline documentation. The original Ares 7 build spec that I helped write before the contract even existed. He couldn't modify that. It's not in Skyforge's system. He picked up the legal pad and set it beside the keyboard. He knew enough about the system to sabotage it. He didn't know enough about me. Victoria stood up. She didn't say anything for a moment, and when she spoke, it was quieter than her usual register. What do you need from me to keep this contained until we have everything documented? Keep Nathan in the building, but away from any networked system. No external calls if you can manage it, but don't make it obvious. He paused. And I need the full personnel file on Dale Rizzo, the guy who called in sick this morning. His access timestamps put him at this building at 2 a.m. on 2 of the modification dates. You think Rizzo knew? I think Rizzo did what he was told by someone he trusted. Whether he understood what he was doing, Adrian shrugged, one shoulder. That's for the federal review to sort out. Victoria nodded once, the kind of nod that's really a decision being made. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Why didn't you push back harder? She asked. When I told you to leave. You could have said something about your clearance, about the Ares 7 background. You had the leverage. Adrian considered the question for a moment with the expression of someone who's thought about it before and still isn't entirely sure of the answer. Because it wasn't about leverage, he said. The aircraft had a problem that needed to be fixed. Whether or not you believed me wasn't the fastest path to getting it fixed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked out. The hangar floor was louder now. More voices, more movement. The kind of controlled energy that builds in a place when people sense without being told that something important is happening. Ray Kowalski had moved on to his next task, but kept finding reasons to pass by the alcove entrance. Marcy was at the main systems station with her tablet, pulling the files Adrian had requested. Soren Hatch was somewhere near the north wall, and the distance between him and Nathan Briggs had grown quietly but measurably in the last hour. Nathan stood near the hydraulic bay with his arms crossed and his phone face down in his hand. From where he stood, he had a clear sight line to the diagnostics alcove. He could see the glow of Adrian's monitors through the entrance. He could see Marcy walking back toward the alcove with a stack of files. He could see very clearly that things were not moving in the direction he needed them to move. He uncrossed his arms. He looked down at his phone, then looked toward the rear exit, a fire door near the service corridor that opened to the parking structure outside. His access badge still worked on that door. He knew because he'd checked it 20 minutes ago when he made the quiet calculation that a building you can still leave is different from a building you're trapped in. He made the calculation again now, and the answer was different than it had been 20 minutes ago. He started walking. Not fast, not with any visible purpose, just a man moving through a large building in the practiced way of someone who belongs there. Past the hydraulic station, past the North Corridor junction, toward the rear service corridor. He was 15 feet from the fire door when Victoria's voice came from behind him. Nathan! He stopped, turned around. She was standing at the corridor entrance with 2 security leads behind her and an expression that he had seen on her face before. The boardroom version, the one she used when the conversation was already over and she was simply managing the announcement. I need you to come with me, she said. We're going to sit down with legal and HR and talk through a few things. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the fire door. He thought about his phone and the calls he hadn't made yet, and the people on the other end of those calls who were waiting on information he could no longer guarantee he'd be able to provide. Sure, he said. His voice was steady. Of course. He walked back toward her, and the two security leads fell in on either side without touching him, and the fire doors stayed closed, and Nathan Briggs moved through the hangar he had controlled for 11 years with the careful composure of a man who had not yet decided whether he was out of options or simply out of the obvious ones. Inside the alcove, Adrian Cross was already on the next layer of the access log, working backward through the architecture of a plan that had been built carefully and over a long time, finding in each false timestamp an altered parameter, the shape of a betrayal that had never been about the aircraft at all. The room they put Nathan in was not an interrogation room. Skyforge Dynamics didn't have interrogation rooms. It had conference spaces, and the one on the second floor of the administrative wing had a long table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with someone's half-erased supply chain diagram still on it, and a window that looked out over the employee parking lot. Victoria's legal counsel, a measured woman named Patricia Ossie, was already seated when Nathan arrived with the two security leads. HR's director, a man named Gary Pullman, who looked like he hadn't slept either, sat beside her with a manila folder he kept his hands flat on top of. Nathan sat down across from them, set his phone face up on the table, and said, "I'd like to understand what this is about." "We're conducting an internal review in conjunction with a federal oversight inquiry," Patricia said. "We need to ask you some questions about your role in the systems integration process for Condor 1. "Of course," Nathan said. "Hey, happy to help." He said it with the even confidence of a man who had thought through this conversation ahead of time, which he had. He'd been thinking through it since 3:52 in the morning, when an alert from a secondary monitoring application on his personal phone had told him that an unscheduled diagnostic session had been opened on the aircraft's ground port. He'd had almost 2 hours to work out what he would say and what he wouldn't, which parts to concede and which to redirect, and where the gaps in the documentation would make his version of events at least plausible enough to survive a first round of questioning. What he hadn't fully accounted for was how much time Adrian Cross could cover in 2 hours. Back in the alcove, Adrian had the full picture laid out across both monitors now. The access log on the left screen, a reconstructed timeline of system modifications on the right, and his legal pad filled front and back with handwritten cross-references. Marcy Velt was at a secondary station outside the alcove entrance, compiling the documentation package that the federal oversight contact had requested, moving between her tablet and a desktop terminal with the focused efficiency of someone who has set everything else aside. Soren Hatch had come to the alcove entrance on his own, 20 minutes after Victoria had walked Nathan to the conference room upstairs. He'd stood at the entrance with his arms at his sides and said, "I need to talk to someone." Adrian had looked up. "About the log entries." It wasn't a question. Soren's expression confirmed it anyway. "I didn't know what I was modifying," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "Come in," Adrian said. "Sit down." Soren sat in the leaning chair in the corner, the one that had been pushed aside earlier, and spent the next 22 minutes telling Adrian exactly what Nathan had told him, exactly what he'd been shown, and exactly what he'd done based on that instruction. He was precise, which Adrian appreciated. He wasn't minimizing his own role, but he also wasn't dramatizing it. He'd been given documents that appeared to authorize integration updates. He'd followed the procedure he'd been trained to follow, and he'd logged the entries under his credentials because Nathan had told him that consolidating the access trail would simplify the final audit. "Did the documents seem legitimate to you at the time?" Adrian asked. "They looked like every other integration authorization document I've seen on this contract." "But you had a question." Soren looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because you're sitting here instead of waiting to see what happens." Adrian wrote something on his legal pad. "What was the question?" Soren was quiet for a moment. "The modification on the 22nd, the heiress parameter change. Nathan gave me the authorization document for it, and I logged it, but afterward I looked at what the change actually did to the system behavior. And I couldn't figure out why a certified aircraft undergoing final pre-flight checks would need that parameter adjusted. It moved the authentication sequence outside the nominal operating window." He paused. "I asked Nathan about it the next morning. He told me it was a DoD-requested calibration for the specific operational profile of this mission. And you accepted that. He's been my direct supervisor for 8 years. Soren stopped. "Yeah, I accepted it." Adrian nodded, writing. He wasn't judging. That was the thing Soren hadn't expected. There was no performance of judgment in Adrian's response. No moment where he paused to let the weight of Soren's answer settle as a moral verdict. He just kept writing, kept cross-referencing, kept building the record. "I'm going to need you to provide a written statement covering everything you just told me," Adrian said. "Timing, what you were shown, what instructions you were given. Keep it factual and sequential. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Don't talk to Nathan before you do. If he contacts you, don't respond and document that he tried." Soren stood up. He looked like a man who had put down something heavy, but wasn't certain yet whether he'd put it in the right place. "What happens to me?" "That depends on things I'm not the one deciding," Adrian said honestly. "But the difference between someone who was used and someone who participated is documented, and right now you're the one helping document it." Soren left. Adrian turned back to his screens. The thing about the access log, the thing that had taken Adrian the longest to fully trace, was that it was almost clean. That was the most unsettling part of it. Not because it made the tampering invisible, but because it told him something specific about who had done this. Not someone who panicked and made changes carelessly, but someone who understood the system well enough to know which parts of the record were reviewed routinely and which parts were only pulled in the event of an audit. The modifications had been threaded through the non-routine portions. Not invisible. Nothing digital is truly invisible to someone who knows what they're looking for, but deliberately buried in the noise. The ARRIS 7-parameter change had been logged as a routine calibration update, filed under a category that wouldn't trigger a review flag unless an auditor specifically requested a cross-check against the original build specification. The pressurization parameter had been logged as part of a scheduled maintenance cycle that had actually occurred, making it appear as though the modification was part of a legitimate maintenance action. Someone had studied the audit process carefully enough to know where to hide things. Adrian had found both because he had the original build documentation in his own files, not in Skyforge's system, documentation that predated the contract and that Nathan Briggs had no access to and therefore no ability to account for. He was pulling the third layer of the log now, the system's own internal write record, a deeper archive that most users didn't know existed because it wasn't part of the standard interface. When he found the thing that changed the shape of the whole picture, there was a secondary modification dated 3 days ago that hadn't appeared in any of the access log entries he'd reviewed. It was buried in the write record under a system housekeeping timestamp that would look, to anyone scanning the archive quickly, like an automated maintenance process. But it wasn't automated. It had been executed manually using a credential set that had been deleted from the active user database, an account that no longer officially existed, but whose authentication token had apparently not been fully purged from the system's memory allocation. The credential belonged to a user account that had been created during the early integration phase, used for approximately 3 weeks, and then removed. The account name in the write record was a string of numbers that meant nothing on its own. But the IP address associated with the session was logged in a separate network record that Adrian had to request through Marcy. And when the IP came back, it matched a workstation in Nathan Briggs's private office. The secondary modification was not a repair or a correction. It was a setup. Adrian leaned back in the leaning chair. He'd reclaimed it at some point without noticing, and looked at what the modification had done. It had installed a small executable in the ARS-7 authentication layer. A script, designed to activate when the system underwent an external diagnostic review and to do exactly one thing: write a new log entry, backdated to the first week of the contract, showing that Adrian Cross had accessed and modified the ARS-7 parameter set. The script was already dormant in the system. Waiting. If Adrian had connected to the ARS-7 layer directly, as he would have needed to do during a routine deep diagnostic, the script would have activated, created the false entry, and given Nathan Briggs a documented trail placing Adrian as the original saboteur. By the time anyone verified the entry's authenticity, the mission would have been canceled, the damage would have been done, and Nathan's access records would have been the clean ones. Adrian sat with that for a moment. Not out of fear, but out of the particular feeling that comes from understanding exactly how close something got. He picked up his phone and called the Federal Oversight contact. Bets. Upstairs in the conference room, Nathan had been answering questions for 40 minutes. He was good at it. Patricia Osei was methodical but not aggressive, and Gary Pullman mostly took notes. Nathan had conceded the things that were obviously documented. Yes, he had administrative access. Yes, Soren Hatch operated under his direction. Yes, some of the integration filing had been consolidated under a single credential set to streamline the audit process, which he described as an efficiency decision he'd made in consultation with the integration team. He hadn't been asked about the ERA's 7 parameters specifically yet. He was waiting for that. He had an answer ready. What he didn't have ready was the knock at the conference room door and the appearance of a woman he didn't recognize, mid-40s, dark blazer, federal contractor ID badge clipped to her lapel, who came in with a tablet under her arm and handed Patricia Osei a document without speaking. Patricia read it. Her expression didn't change much, but Nathan had been in enough rooms with enough lawyers to know the difference between an expression that hasn't changed and an expression that's being held in place. "Mr. Briggs," Patricia said, "I need to take a short recess." "Of course," Nathan said. He sat alone in the conference room for 6 minutes. He counted them. He looked at his phone and thought about the calls he still hadn't made, the people waiting on updates he could no longer provide with the certainty they needed. He thought about the executable he'd installed 3 days ago, the failsafe he'd called it in his own mind, the insurance, and whether it had activated when cross-connected to the diagnostic port this morning. It should have activated. He'd set the trigger parameters carefully, unless Cross had found it first. But Cross was a systems technician. Thorough, yes, but the write record where the script was embedded wasn't a place most technicians went. Nathan had chosen it specifically because it was deep enough to be safe. He told himself this. He was still telling himself this when Patricia Osei came back into the room, and this time she wasn't alone. Victoria was with her, and Victoria's face had left the controlled boardroom register entirely. "Nathan," Victoria said, and the way she said his name, not cold, not loud, just flat with a kind of exhaustion that's close to grief, told him that the insurance hadn't worked. "Victoria," he said, "whatever you've been told—" "He found the script," she said. Nathan stopped talking. "The executable in the Eris write record, the one that was going to put Adrian Cross's name on the modification log." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, and for a moment she just looked at him in the way that people look at something they're still catching up to understanding. 11 years, Nathan." "Victoria, let me explain what that was." "Tell me what it was." "It was a contingency." He said it steadily. "The contract has been under pressure since the DoD review last quarter. I was concerned about liability exposure if the mission encountered complications, and I wanted documentation in place that could redirect any inquiry to an external source. It was a risk management decision. You were going to frame a man for something you did," Victoria said. "It's more complicated than that." "It's not, actually." She leaned forward slightly. "You sabotaged the aircraft. You falsified the maintenance records. You installed a script designed to blame someone else when the sabotage was discovered. And underneath all of it, you had investors ready to move on the company's stock the moment the DoD contract fell through." She paused. "Which investors, Nathan? Who's been funding this?" The silence that followed was the kind that has a very specific texture, the silence of someone who has run out of the moves they prepared and is now deciding whether to improvise or stop. Nathan looked at the table. "I want to speak with my attorney." "That's fair," Patricia said immediately, in the tone of someone who expected that answer. "We'll stop here." Victoria stood. She looked at Nathan for a moment longer. The look of someone trying to locate something familiar in a face she's known for a long time and finding the geography has shifted. Then she walked out. Adrian had stopped the script before it activated. The process had taken 11 careful minutes, because disabling an embedded executable in a legacy authentication layer without triggering it or corrupting the surrounding system required the same kind of attention to sequence that diffusing something physical requires. Not speed, not force, just exact order of operations. He'd documented everything before he touched it, screenshots, a screen recording running on his laptop's secondary process, timestamps from his own monitoring software. By the time he disabled the script and extracted it as an inert file for evidence, he had a complete record of its existence, its structure, its activation trigger, and the credential trail that led back to Nathan Briggs's office workstation. He sent the package to the Federal Oversight contact. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling of the diagnostics alcove for approximately 30 seconds, the first time he'd stopped moving since 3:15 in the morning. Marcy came to the entrance. "How bad is it?" "The script's neutralized. The evidence is intact." He looked back at the screens. "It's not bad from here. It's just a lot of documentation." "Federal team is 30 minutes out." "Okay." She lingered for a moment. "You knew there'd be a secondary layer, didn't you? A fail-safe." Adrian considered the question. "I thought there probably was one. Someone who planned this carefully doesn't walk away without an exit route." "That's why you recorded everything before you touched it." "That's why I recorded everything before I touched it." Marcy nodded slowly. "I've been on this aircraft for 11 months, she said. "I signed my name to certifications on this system." "Woo? You signed certifications based on the logs you were given access to," Adrian said. "The logs were manipulated before you saw them." "I know that. It doesn't make it feel a lot better." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She pushed off the doorframe. "I'll let you know when the federal team arrives." She was halfway back to her station when Adrian called after her. "Marcy." She turned. "Your subsystem documentation, the integration notes you keep separately from the official log, you have those?" "On my personal drive, yes." "Don't lose those." She held his gaze for a moment. "Already backed them up twice," she said, and went back to her station. Ox. Ray Kowalski found out what was happening the same way most of the floor crew did, incrementally, through fragments that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. First, it was the security leads posted at the aircraft's data ports. Then it was someone mentioning Nathan Briggs was upstairs in a meeting with legal. Then it was the federal contractor ID badge that someone near the entrance had seen on a woman who'd arrived without announcement. Ray was back near the fueling station when Teo came around the equipment cart with the expression of someone who's just heard something and isn't sure whether to repeat it. "Someone's saying the operations chief sabotaged the aircraft," Teo said. "Like, intentionally." Ray set down the pressure gauge he was holding. "Where'd you hear that?" "Kerner, from electrical. He was near the mezzanine stairs when they walked Briggs upstairs." Ray was quiet for a moment. He looked at the aircraft in the middle of the staging floor. He thought about the last 7 months. Every system check, every certification signature, every time he'd stood in front of that aircraft and done his job on the assumption that everyone else had done theirs. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then the guy who called it this morning, the contract tech they threw out, he's the one who caught it." "Looks like." Ray picked up the pressure gauge again and set it in the equipment cart. He didn't say anything else, but something in his expression had shifted. The particular shift that happens in people who work with their hands and understand, in a concrete and physical way, what it means when the thing you built was built on a lie. Thus, Victoria found Adrian in the alcove at 8:44 in the morning. She didn't knock. There was no door to knock on. But she paused at the entrance in a way that served the same purpose, and he looked up. "Federal team is incoming," she said. "Marcy told me. 20 minutes." She stepped inside. The alcove felt smaller with both of them in it. Not uncomfortable exactly, just close. She looked at the screens for a moment, at the architecture of the investigation laid out across 2 monitors, at the legal pad so thoroughly covered in his handwriting that the bottom third of the page was overlapping annotations. "The script he built," she said. "If you hadn't found it, I found it. But if you hadn't," he looked at her, "then the diagnostic review would have pulled a log showing I was the one who modified the ARIS-7 parameter. Federal oversight arrives. They find an incident report that points to the external contractor, the contract technician who doesn't work here permanently and has no long-term stake in defending himself through your legal channels. Nathan stays clean, the acquisition moves forward, and Skyforge loses the contract and the company." He said it directly, without drama. "That was the plan." Victoria absorbed that. "He knew you were good enough to find the sabotage, so he built the frame before you started looking. He thought he knew how deep I'd go. He was wrong about that." She crossed her arms. "Not like Marcy, Not from cold, but from the particular body language of someone carrying something they haven't found a place to put down yet. "When we brought you on for this contract," she said, "it was Nathan's recommendation. He put your name forward." Adrian looked at her. "I know." "You know?" "I suspected it when I started tracing the credential history. He's the one who requested a contractor with Era 7 background. He's the one who narrowed the scope of my access during integration." He paused. "He thought he could control what I found. He brought me in because a clean review from someone with my clearance level would make the certification bulletproof. He just didn't plan on me finding the sabotage before the flight." Victoria stared at him. "He used you as cover. And then when the cover started looking like exposure, he tried to flip it." Adrian turned back to his screen. "It's not the stupidest plan I've ever seen. It almost worked." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped slightly. Not in volume, but in register, the way a person's voice drops when they're talking about something they're still inside of. "Do you know what the worst part is? Not the sabotage, not the frame-up. It's that I stood on that floor this morning and I chose him. When you came to me with documented evidence and I had to make a call, I looked at you and I looked at him, and I chose the man I knew." She paused. "I threw you out." Adrian didn't fill the silence with reassurance. He didn't say it was understandable or that anyone would have done the same. He said, "Yeah, you did." She took that without flinching. "I'm sorry." "I know. That's not enough." "I know that too," he said. "But it's where we are." She nodded once, stood up straight, the way she did when a decision had been made and it was time to move through it rather than around it. "The federal team is going to need full access to the administrative network. I'll authorize it before they arrive." She moved toward the door. "Nathan's attorney is on his way. He's not going to talk without counsel." "I don't need him to talk," Adrian said. "Everything I need is in the documentation." Victoria paused at the entrance. She looked back at him. The canvas bag on the equipment cart, the crooked legal pad, the two monitors running the kind of diagnostic that 11 months of other people's work had failed to catch. "What do you need from me right now?" Adrian thought about it for a moment. "Coffee," he said, "if there's any, and keep everyone off the aircraft until the federal team clears it." She almost said something. Instead, she walked out. 3 minutes later, a crew assistant appeared at the alcove entrance with a paper cup of coffee, the bad kind, from the machine near the break room, too hot and faintly burnt, and set it on the edge of the desk without a word. Adrian wrapped his hand around the cup, took a sip, went back to work. Dale Rizzo's personnel file told a partial story. He was 44, had been with Skyforge for 3 years, hired on Nathan's recommendation from a previous contract position at a mid-sized avionics firm in Ohio. His performance reviews were solid without being exceptional. He had 2 access violations in his record from his first year, minor ones, credential sharing that had been addressed through a formal warning, which told Adrian that Dale was the kind of person who followed direction more than protocol, and that Nathan had known that when he brought him in. The IP records from the nights of the 2 deepest system modifications showed Dale's workstation active alongside Nathan's during the same 3-hour window. Not Nathan doing the work while Dale watched. 2 separate sessions, 2 separate tasks, coordinated in time. Nathan had written the parameter changes directly. Dale had managed the log entry timestamps. Specialized work, divided between 2 people, neither of whom had the full picture of what they were building together. Whether Dale understood the destination of what he was building was a question the federal investigators would need to answer. What Adrian could document was the what and the how. The why, the full architecture of Nathan's investment scheme, the names of the people waiting to move on Skyforge's stock. That was a layer deeper than the aircraft's systems, and it was already being worked from a different direction by people in Washington whose names Adrian didn't know and didn't need to. He added Dale Rizzo's access records to the documentation package and moved on. By the time the federal team arrived, 2 people, a systems technician named Reyes and a federal investigator who introduced himself only by his last name, Carmichael, Adrian had a complete incident report ready in digital and printed form. Carmichael reviewed the first 8 pages in the alcove entrance, while Reyes started examining the aircraft's external diagnostic ports, and Adrian watched Carmichael's expression cycle through something between professional recognition and the particular kind of grim satisfaction that investigators get when a complicated picture finally holds together. The executable, Carmichael said, without looking up from the report. Isolated and extracted. It's in the evidence file, page 14. Carmichael turned to page 14. He was quiet for a moment. He built this 3 days ago? Based on the right record, yes. And it would have activated during your diagnostic session? Yes. Carmichael looked up then. He studied Adrian for a moment with the calibrated assessment of someone whose job involves reading people quickly and accurately. You recorded everything before you touched it? Yes. Why? Adrian looked at him. Because I knew there'd be a layer I hadn't found yet. Carmichael held his gaze for another second. Then he went back to the report. Okay, he said, and that single word carried a lot of professional weight, the weight of someone who has seen a lot of sloppy work and has just encountered the opposite of it. Let's go through this from the beginning. Outside the alcove, the hangar had settled into a different kind of energy than it had carried at 4:47 in the morning. Not relief. It was too early for relief, and too much was still unsettled. But the particular tension of an unknown danger had shifted into the more bearable tension of a known one being managed, and that difference was something the people who work in large industrial spaces feel in their bodies before they articulate it in words. Ray Kowalski was back at his station. Marcy Velt was compiling documentation at the systems terminal. Soren Hatch was in a side office writing his statement with a pen and a blank sheet of paper, taking more time with it than anything he'd written in years. The aircraft sat on the staging platform in the middle of the hangar, enormous and still, waiting. Nathan Briggs sat in the conference room upstairs with his attorney now, and the conversation there was a different kind of conversation entirely, one that Adrian Cross was not part of and did not need to be. He had done his piece. The rest of it would happen in the order that these things happen. Interviews, warrants, financial records, subpoenaed from accounts that would eventually trace back to people Nathan had been careful never to meet in buildings with security cameras. What remained for Adrian was the aircraft. He looked at Reyes, who was running the same baseline diagnostic that Adrian had run at 3:15 in the morning, moving through it with the methodical attention of someone who trusts documentation but verifies anyway. How long for the full system review? Adrian asked. Reyes checked the diagnostic progress. 3 hours, maybe 3.5. Depends what we find in the Eris layer. You'll find the authentication key out of sequence. I've documented the original spec. We'll need to restore it manually. You can do that? That's why I'm here, Adrian said. He picked up his coffee cup, still slightly warm, and moved toward the aircraft for the first time since 5 a.m., when they'd walked him away from it and toward the door. He stood at the base of the access gantry and looked up at the airframe, at the lines of it, at the quiet mechanical fact of a machine that had been built carefully and then compromised carefully and now needed to be made right. He didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt tired, which was the honest response to 6 hours of working backward through someone else's deliberate damage. And underneath the tiredness was the simpler feeling of a man who found a problem and refused to leave it alone until he understood it. Not because anyone asked him to stay, and not because he needed to prove something, but because the problem was real and the consequences were real, and walking away from real things had never been something he'd known how to do. He started up the gantry. The clearance came through at 1423. It arrived as a formal document transmitted through the Federal Oversight Portal, 2 pages, dense with reference numbers and authorization codes, signed by Carmichael and countersigned by the DoD contract liaison whose name Adrian recognized from the original Eris 7 project documentation nearly a decade ago. The document certified that Condor 1 had been restored to its original certified configuration, that both the pressurization system and the Eris 7 communication architecture had been independently verified as airworthy, and that the aircraft was cleared to proceed with its scheduled operational mission at the discretion of Skyforge Dynamics and the assigned flight crew. Marcy Velt printed 2 copies. She handed one to the flight operations coordinator and walked the second copy to Victoria Hale's mezzanine office herself, because some documents you don't send through the internal mail system. Victoria read it standing up. She read it twice. Then she set it on her desk and stood there for a moment with her hand flat on top of it, not pressing down, just resting there, The way a person's hand rests on something they want to confirm is real. She picked up her phone and called the flight operations coordinator. "Move to final pre-departure sequence," she said. "I want wheels up by 1700. Then she came downstairs. The hangar had changed character again in the 2 hours since the integration check had cleared. The particular holding pattern energy of the morning, the waiting, the uncertainty, the work that continued without full knowledge of whether it was building towards something or managing a collapse, had resolved into something more direct. People knew now, or knew enough. The aircraft was clean, the clearance was issued, the mission was proceeding. The details of what had happened, the full architecture of Nathan's plan and the Voss Group's involvement would filter through in the days that followed. For now, what the floor crew knew was what mattered most practically. The job they'd come in to do was still the job, and they could do it. Ray Kowalski was at the fueling station running final sequence checks when the flight operations coordinator came through with the departure confirmation, and he felt the shift in himself that he always felt at this point in a pre-departure cycle. The tightening of focus, the particular concentration that came from knowing that everything from here forward counted in a different way than everything before it. He'd felt it on 7 DoD contracts. He felt it now with the added weight of knowing that this particular aircraft had been closer to not flying than any aircraft he'd worked on, and that the reason it was going to fly was a man he'd watched get walked out of the building that morning by a security supervisor. He ran his checks with the care of someone doing it for keeps. Teo, working beside him, was quieter than he'd been all day. The talking to manage uncertainty phase had passed. There was nothing left to manage through conversation. There was just the work. Adrian was still at the alcove desk when Victoria found him. He'd sent the documentation package to Carmichael an hour earlier and had spent the time since doing the smaller, quieter work of the day, organizing his own records, closing out the diagnostic sessions, preparing the system logs for handover to the federal evidence chain. The canvas bag was packed again, the broken zipper on the outside pocket still broken. His laptop was closed. The legal pad, both sides fully covered, was in the bag. He looked up when she came in. She didn't have her executives with her this time, and she didn't have the particular posture she'd carried that morning when she'd crossed the hangar floor to dismiss him. She was wearing the same jacket she'd had on at 4:47 in the morning, which said something about the kind of day it had been. And she had the look of someone who has been moving through a long, hard situation and has reached the part of it where the immediate crisis has resolved, but the weight of it hasn't lifted yet. She sat down in the straight chair near the door. Not across from him, the way you sit for a formal conversation, but at an angle. The way you sit when the conversation is necessary, but you're not interested in performing it. "The clearance came through," she said. "I know. Carmichael sent me the confirmation. We're moving to final pre-departure. Wheels up at 1700. Adrian nodded. He looked at the closed laptop, then back at her. "I want to say something," Victoria said. "Formally. I asked Carmichael if there was a specific protocol for—" She stopped, started again. "The formal part is that Skyforge will be issuing a written statement to the DoD contract liaison that confirms your role in identifying and resolving the security and safety compromise. That statement will be part of the contract record." "Thank you. The less formal part." She paused. "I owe you a real apology, not a corporate one. This morning, on that floor, I made a choice about who to believe, and I made it for the wrong reasons. I made it because Nathan had been there for 11 years, and you'd been there for 11 weeks, and I treated duration as a substitute for evidence." She said it without softening it. That was arrogance, and it almost put people in the air on a compromised aircraft. Adrian looked at her steadily. "It did," he said. "Yes." She didn't look away from it. "I'm sorry." "I know you are." He picked up his pen, turned it once in his hand, set it down. "The apology matters. I'm not saying it doesn't, but what happened this morning isn't going to be fixed by an apology. It's going to be fixed by what you do differently going forward. I know that. Your operations chief had administrative access to every system on that aircraft and credentials that nobody cross-checked against an independent baseline. That's not a Nathan Briggs problem. That's an organizational structure problem. He could do what he did because the structure made it possible. Victoria listened without interrupting, which was something she'd become, over the course of the morning, more willing to do. Your maintenance log system records entries without verifying them against physical presence data. Your integration review process relies on the same person to authorize changes and audit them. Your access controls don't flag after-hours sessions on classified systems. He wasn't being harsh. He was being specific, the way he was always specific, because specificity was the only form of honesty he trusted. The sabotage worked as long as it did because your systems were built to trust the people operating them without the tools to detect when that trust was being abused. I know, Victoria said. I've been thinking about all of that since about 6 a.m. Good. She held his gaze. I want to offer you something, and I want to do it properly, which means I want to tell you what it is before you respond to it, and I want you to actually think about it rather than answering immediately. She paused. I'm creating an independent safety and security operations function, reporting directly to me, outside the normal management chain, with federal oversight integration built in from the start. Full access to all classified system documentation, authority to flag and halt any operation on safety grounds regardless of schedule or contract pressure. Another pause. I want you to lead it. Adrian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the canvas bag on the equipment cart. He thought about the drive home that was waiting for him on the other side of this conversation, and the apartment that would be the same temperature it always was when he got back from a long contract, and the beer in the refrigerator that he'd been thinking about intermittently since about hour 4 of the morning. What does the reporting structure look like? He asked. Directly to me. No intermediate layer? And when I flag something and the schedule says it can't wait, the schedule waits. You said that this morning too, he said. About other things. You said Nathan's sign-off was sufficient and the aircraft had been certified and we were 6 hours from departure. He said it without accusation, just fact. Words are not a structure. Victoria absorbed that. What would a structure look like to you? He thought about it. Not for long. He'd been thinking about versions of this problem for most of his professional life. Written authority protocol. Any safety flag I issue requires a dual confirmation from both the federal oversight contact and your outside legal counsel before it can be overridden. Not just your approval, a 3-party verification process. That way the authority isn't personal, it's procedural, which means it survives changes in personnel, including changes in you. Victoria blinked slightly at that last part. Not offended, but recalibrating. She hadn't expected him to build safeguards against her specifically. She thought about it for a moment, and the more she thought about it, the more it made the kind of sense that things make when they're right rather than merely convenient. That's a significant constraint on my own authority, she said. Yes, he said. That's the point. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the alcove, the hangar sounds had shifted again. The departure preparation cycle had its own acoustic signature, a slightly higher frequency of activity, voices at greater distances. The hydraulic sound of the aircraft access system cycling through final checks. I'll agree to that structure, she said, in writing, before I accept. In writing, she confirmed, before you accept. She looked at him. Will you accept? I'll read the document first. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Fair. She stood, straightened her jacket. The motion was familiar enough to be automatic. The physical reset that preceded re-engagement, the gesture of someone putting themselves back into operational mode. I'm going to the floor. The departure sequence starts in 40 minutes. I'll be there, Adrian said. She paused at the entrance. One more thing. She turned back. When I walked out of this room this morning to find the security supervisor, after I told you to leave, you could see it on my face. What was coming, and you didn't argue. You didn't try to stop it. No. Why? He picked up his pen again. Because arguing with you in that moment wasn't going to fix the aircraft. The aircraft needed to be fixed. He turned the pen once. Arguing with you was your problem. I had mine. She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked out. The next 40 minutes moved with the particular momentum of a departure sequence that has been delayed and is now catching up to itself. Not rushed, because rushing in this context would be its own kind of error, but purposeful in a way that left no room for anything extraneous. Flight operations ran the final checklists. Fueling was confirmed and sealed. The communications equipment in Condor 1's forward station was tested against the ARE-7 Now Clean authentication layer and returned clean responses on every channel. Carmichael was still in the building, supervising the evidence handover with Marcy, when he got word that departure was confirmed. He came out to the hangar floor briefly, not to supervise, just to be present in the way that people are sometimes present at the completion of a thing they've been part of, even when their part is finished. He stood near the edge of the staging area and watched the final preparations with his evidence case under his arm and the expression of a man who has seen a long morning come out the right way and is allowing himself, briefly, to acknowledge that. Soren Hatch was on the floor. He hadn't been told to leave. Nobody had told him to leave, which was itself a kind of ambiguous signal, and he'd gone back to his station after giving his statement and done his work with the same precision he always applied, because stopping felt worse than continuing, and because he didn't know yet what the next thing was supposed to be, and in the absence of knowing, he did what he knew how to do. When the departure sequence started, he ran the checks that fell within his scope and signed his name to the certifications that required his signature and did not think about what his name on a document meant in this particular context, because that was a thought that would be waiting for him regardless of when he got to it. Ray Kowalski sealed the fueling connections at 16:48 and stepped back and looked at the aircraft and felt the specific satisfaction of a completed physical task that carries real consequence. Not pride exactly. Ray didn't perform satisfaction, he just had it or didn't. But the grounded, uncomplicated feeling of having done something correctly in circumstances that required it to be done correctly. "We good?" Teo asked from beside him. "We're good," Ray said. The crew assembled on the hangar floor at 16:55. Not by formal instruction. Victoria hadn't called in all hands, hadn't organized a send-off. It happened the way things happen in workplaces when something significant is concluding and people feel the pull of witnessing it. The fueling crew, the communications technicians, the equipment handlers, the integration team, they came to the edges of the staging area in ones and twos and stood there with the varied postures of people who've had a long, strange, significant day and are standing at its end without quite knowing what to do with their hands. Victoria stood near the primary gantry with the flight operations coordinator and the two assigned crew members who would accompany the aircraft. She was talking to the coordinator about something procedural, but she kept glancing toward the alcove entrance. Adrian came out at 16:58, canvas bag over one shoulder, jacket on, the legal pad, now full, front and back, and worth more as a document than most things he'd ever written, tucked under his arm for transport. He came out and crossed the floor toward the staging area, and the people standing around it watched him come the way people watch someone they've been reassessing over the course of a long day. He stopped near the edge of the staging area, a few feet from where Ray Kowalski was standing. Ray looked at him. "Good work today," he said. Just that. Not elaborate, not performed. "You too," Adrian said. The exchange was not loud enough for most of the floor to hear, but the people nearest to it heard it, and something in the simplicity of it. Two men who'd done their jobs in a difficult day acknowledging each other without making a production of it landed differently than any formal statement would have. Victoria stepped away from the coordinator and came toward Adrian. She stopped a few feet from him, which put them roughly in the center of the staging area, with the assembled floor crew around them and Condor 1 behind her, and the overhead lights at full brightness, because in Skyforge's hangar, the lights were always at full brightness, and this morning they had never gone off. She didn't have a speech prepared. She'd thought about preparing something and then decided against it, because a prepared speech was the right move for a press event, and this was not a press event. "I want to say something to the floor," she said, and her voice was loud enough to carry, and the hangar went quiet the way large spaces go quiet when one person's voice decides to fill them. Everyone was listening. "This morning I made a significant error in judgment." She didn't preface it, didn't buffer it. "A contractor came to me with documented evidence of a safety-critical systems compromise, and I chose authority over evidence. I chose familiarity over facts, and I told him his career was over if he touched the aircraft again." She paused. "The Pentagon called 43 minutes later and told me he was the only person in the building authorized to fix the problem he'd found." The floor was very quiet. What followed The investigation, the restoration, the clearance was his work, done under federal authority, but done by him alone, starting before most of you were awake, continuing through circumstances that I made considerably harder than they needed to be. She looked at Adrian directly. I am publicly and formally apologizing for that, in front of this company, which is the place it needs to happen. Adrian held her gaze. He didn't look away, and he didn't look like he wanted to, but he also didn't perform gratitude. He just stood there and let the moment be what it was. I'm also telling you, Victoria continued, that Skyforge is changing. Not as a response to what Nathan Briggs did. We'll deal with that through the appropriate channels, and it will take time. But as a response to what this morning exposed about how we operate. We built a culture where schedules were treated as more important than safety flags, where authority was treated as sufficient substitute for verification, where the people closest to the technical truth were the last ones consulted when a problem arose. She looked around the floor, at Ray, at Marcy, at Teo, at Soren standing near the north wall, at the people she recognized and the people she didn't, at the whole human apparatus that had been running since midnight on the assumption that the framework above them was sound. That changes. It wasn't a promise that transformed the room dramatically. The room stayed the way it was. Tired, cautious, the particular mix of relief and residual tension that comes after a day like this one. But something shifted in it, slightly, in the way things shift when a person in authority says something honest instead of something polished, and the people listening can tell the difference. Marcy Velt, standing near the systems terminal, felt it. She crossed her arms, from cold as always, and looked at the aircraft and thought about the 11 months she'd worked on it and the documentation she kept on her personal drive that she'd backed up twice this morning. And she thought that whatever came next, she had done the work she'd been put there to do. Soren Hatch, near the north wall, heard every word and stood with the particular stillness of a man processing something that he'd carry differently depending on what happened in the days ahead. He'd done something wrong. He'd also done something right, when it counted, in the hours where it still made a difference. He didn't know yet which of those things would define the next chapter of his professional life, and he suspected that question wouldn't be answered today. Ray Kowalski listened and nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man for whom words don't mean much until they're followed by something concrete and who is willing to wait for the concrete. Passem. The departure was scheduled for 1700 and it departed at 1706 because 6 minutes of variance at the end of a day, like this one, was not something anyone was going to note with anything other than mild relief. The flight crew boarded at 1659. The forward station came online at 1701. Adrian knew because he could see the RS-7 system status indicator from the external monitor at the secondary diagnostic station. And when the authentication key confirmed sequence and the communication layer went active, he felt the small, specific satisfaction of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The gantries retracted. The support equipment pulled back. The hangar doors at the far end of the staging bay opened in the slow, wide way of doors that were built for a specific scale of thing, and the late afternoon light came in. Not golden and cinematic, just the flat, clear light of an afternoon in a part of the country where afternoon light is usually flat and clear, falling across the staging floor at the angle it always fell and landing on the aircraft the way light lands on a machine, indifferently, without meaning, purely as physics. Condor 1 moved under its own power toward the taxi line. The floor crew watched it go. Nobody said much. The departure of an aircraft at the end of a 12-hour pre-departure cycle is not a moment that calls for speech. It calls for watching, and they watched. Ray with his arms at his sides, Teo beside him, Marcy still at her station but turned toward the hangar doors, the rest of the crew positioned around the edges of the staging area, in the loose, unorganized way of people who've gathered without being told to gather. Adrian watched it from near the secondary diagnostic station. He had his bag over his shoulder. He'd said goodbye to Marcy 10 minutes earlier, a practical conversation about the documentation handover, and at the end of it she'd said, "Come back if you take the job," and he'd said, "We'll see." And she'd gone back to her terminal. He hadn't said goodbye to anyone else specifically. That wasn't how he operated. Victoria was standing 10 feet to his left. She was watching the aircraft move, and she wasn't talking, and neither was he, and neither of them moved to close the 10 feet between them, because the distance was right, and the quiet was right, and the aircraft was moving toward the door, and that was the thing to watch. The aircraft cleared the hangar threshold at 17:04. The hangar doors began closing at 17:05, with the slow, mechanical certainty of hydraulic systems doing their work. At 17:06, from the direction of the taxi line, the sound of the engines building to departure power came through the hangar walls, muffled, felt more than heard, the way you feel large engines through a floor. And then it was gone. Not gone dramatically, just absent in the way that large things become absent when they leave. A space where they were and now aren't. The floor crew dispersed back to their stations or toward the exit, the way people disperse when the moment they gathered for has passed. Ray picked up his tool case. Teo followed him. The coordinator was already on his radio, running the post-departure confirmation sequence. Victoria turned to look at Adrian. "The written protocol will be on your email by end of day tomorrow," she said. "Drafted by outside counsel, reviewed by the DoD liaison." "I'll read it," he said. "Will you give me an answer this week?" He thought about it. "Yes," she nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else, and then decided that what she'd already said was enough, which was its own kind of progress for a person accustomed to having the last word. "Get some rest," she said. "You too," he said. She walked toward the mezzanine stairs. He watched her go for a moment, the straight back, the worn jacket, the slight drag in her step that was the only physical evidence of a 24-plus-hour day. And then he picked up his bag more securely on his shoulder and turned toward the side exit. He sat in his car in the employee parking lot for a few minutes before starting it, not thinking about anything specific, just being still in the way that's necessary after a long time of not being still. The sun was low now, the parking lot half empty, the hangar behind him its own massive silence. He thought about the day and the order it had happened, the way he always reviewed things, not to relitigate them, just to confirm the sequence was intact in his memory, that nothing had blurred or shifted in the way that long, high-stakes days sometimes blurred things. He ran through it, the diagnostic anomaly at 3:47 a.m., the conversation with Nathan, the floor confrontation, the Pentagon call, the access log, Soren's statement, the executable, the restoration, the clearance, the aircraft departing at 17:06. It was intact. All of it. He thought about the offer. Independent safety and security operations, reporting to Victoria with a 3-party verification protocol that he designed himself. Something he'd never had on a contract before. Not just the access and authority, but the structural protection that made the authority real rather than nominal. The kind of protection that didn't depend on whether the person above you was having a good day. He thought about the apartment and the beer in the refrigerator and the quiet that waited there. And he thought about whether that quiet was what he wanted or whether it was just what was familiar. And he didn't reach a conclusion because that was not the kind of question that resolved in a parking lot at 5:15 in the afternoon after a 12-hour shift. He started the car. The legal pad was on the passenger seat. He'd taken it out of the bag when he got in, out of the habit of not wanting something documented to be in a bag with a broken zipper any longer than necessary. He glanced at it. The dense handwriting, the margin annotations, the crossed-out sequence that he'd corrected at 9:20 when he realized he'd reversed 2 steps in the ARS restoration documentation. All of it. The whole morning, reduced to 2 sides of yellow paper in left-leaning, nearly illegible script. He drove out of the parking lot and turned onto the access road that led back to the highway. And the Skyforge hangar shrank in his rear-view mirror the way buildings shrink when you leave them. Gradually, without ceremony. Until it was just a rectangle against the sky. 3 days later, the written protocol arrived in his email at 8:47 in the morning. It was 11 pages, which was longer than he'd expected and more carefully structured than he'd given outside counsel credit for. He read it in full. Twice. He made 4 notes in the margins. Not objections, adjustments, places where the language was ambiguous enough to create exploitable gaps. He emailed the notes to Patricia Osei. She responded within 2 hours. They went back and forth through the morning, and by early afternoon the language had been tightened in the 4 places he'd flagged and left unchanged in the places where he'd had no comment. The final document was 14 pages. He read it one more time, linearly, front to back. He replied to the email thread with 2 words: "I'll accept." Then he closed his laptop and went to make coffee, because the coffee in his apartment was better than the coffee from the machine in the Skyforge break room, and better coffee was one of the few unambiguous improvements he had reliable access to. Marcy Velt was the first person at Skyforge he told directly. He called her, not because she was first on any organizational chart, but because she was the person who'd handed him the secondary cable in the alcove at 6 in the morning and hadn't asked unnecessary questions. And that quality of attention was something he wanted to acknowledge before he walked back into the building. "I heard," she said when he told her, "Victoria sent a company-wide notice this morning." "Ah," she said, effective immediately upon his acceptance, so she was apparently fairly confident. "She was confident this morning too," he said. "That's not always the same thing as right." Marcy made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the same territory. "Different this time, though." "Yeah," he said. "Different this time." Soren Hatch's situation resolved over the following 2 weeks through a process that was not simple and did not produce a clean outcome, which was appropriate given that clean outcomes were rarely accurate ones. The Federal Review found that he had made the modifications in good faith based on fraudulent authorization, which mitigated the liability but did not eliminate it. He was placed on administrative leave pending a further HR process that would take another month to conclude. His statement had been one of 3 things that allowed the federal evidence chain to establish Nathan's authorization pattern beyond documentary dispute, which the federal investigator had communicated to Skyforge's legal team in terms that were not a guarantee but were not ambiguous either. Soren used the leave to think, which was what leave was actually for when it wasn't just a procedural holding pattern. He thought about the 8 years in the document Nathan had shown him and the question he'd decided not to push when Nathan had given him the explanation about classified calibration. He thought about the version of the situation where he'd pushed, where he'd said, "Let me see the supporting documentation," instead of "okay," and what that version would have meant, not as self-punishment, but as a practical question about the specific point where things could have gone differently. He identified the point. He thought about what it would take to recognize a similar point in the future. That was not absolution. He didn't have access to absolution. What he had was an understanding of where he'd made the choice that led to the outcome, and an honest account of why he'd made it, and the decision about what to do with that understanding going forward. It was insufficient, and it was real, and it was what he had. Ray Kowalski didn't hear about Adrian's acceptance until his 2nd week at Skyforge's sister facility in Nevada, where he'd been temporarily assigned to a new contract. He heard it from Teo, who'd stayed at the main facility and texted him. Contract Tech is back, running the new safety function, apparently gave them conditions before he said yes. Ray read it during a break and set his phone down and thought, "Good," and went back to work. Oh, the Voss Group matter took longer. It moved through financial, regulatory, and federal channels at the pace those things move. Not slow out of negligence, but slow because the documentation was extensive, and the legal architecture of a scheme constructed over 14 months required corresponding time to dismantle. Harlan Voss retained 4 lawyers, which was itself an indicator of how seriously he took the documentation Adrian had produced. Nathan Briggs cooperated in the way that people cooperate when they've done the math on their options and identified the least bad one. The outcome of that process was not Adrian's to know in detail, and he didn't try to find out. His piece was the aircraft. His piece was done. What happened to the people who tried to use the aircraft as a mechanism for something else was a different story with different protagonists, and he had enough of his own work to do without following someone else's. The new role formally began on a Monday, which was a day like any Monday, except that Adrian arrived at Skyforge and walked through the main entrance and was handed a badge by the security desk. Not a contractor badge, a staff badge, with his name printed on it in the standard font, and his photo from 2 weeks ago when he'd come in for the HR processing and stood in front of a white wall and looked at the camera with the expression of a man who is willing to be photographed, but not particularly interested in it. He walked through the hangar on the way to the new office. A real office, not an alcove, though it had the same functional, undecorated quality that he would have chosen anyway. And Ray Kowalski was at the fueling station running morning checks and looked up when Adrian passed and gave him the same nod he'd given him on the morning of the departure, the nod that meant you did your job without requiring elaboration. Adrian nodded back. He went to his office. He set his bag down. The same bag, the same broken zipper on the outside pocket, which he had not gotten around to fixing and probably wouldn't. And he opened his laptop and pulled up the first item on his list, which was a review of the access control framework that Marcy had compiled based on the gaps he'd identified from the diagnostic process. It was 47 pages. He started reading. Outside his window, which looked down at a different section of the floor than Victoria's mezzanine overlooked, the hangar was doing what it always did, breathing, turning, people moving through it with purpose, machines being prepared and certified and maintained, the work of keeping things airworthy happening in the unglamorous, repetitive, essential way it happened every day in every facility like this one. He read the access control framework. He made notes. He identified 3 gaps in the first 12 pages and flagged them in the document with comments that were specific enough to be actionable. He worked through the morning without stopping, the same way he'd worked through the morning 3 weeks ago. Not because the situation was equally urgent, but because the work was real, and the work deserved the same attention regardless of the urgency that surrounded it. That was the thing about Adrian Cross that no crisis had created and no recognition would change. The work was the work. It had always been the work. The morning in the hangar, the diagnostic at 3:47 a.m., the executable and the access log, and the 11 careful minutes of disarming a trap that had been built specifically for him. None of it had required him to be a different kind of person than he already was. It had only required him to keep being that person under conditions designed to make it difficult. He finished the access control review at 12:34. He sent his comments to Marcy and put his notes in a new legal pad, same brand, same yellow paper, same cramped left-leaning script, and moved to the next item on his list. The hangar went on around him. Aircraft were prepared. Systems were checked. People did their work. Everything important in that building happened quietly, if you knew where to look. The clearance came through at 14:23. It arrived as a formal document transmitted through the Federal Oversight Portal. 2 pages, dense with reference numbers and authorization codes, signed by Carmichael and countersigned by the DoD contract liaison, whose name Adrian recognized from the original Era 7 project documentation nearly a decade ago. The document certified that Condor 1 had been restored to its original certified configuration, that both the pressurization system and the Era 7 communication architecture had been independently verified as airworthy, and that the aircraft was cleared to proceed with its scheduled operational mission. Marcy Velt printed 2 copies. She handed one to the flight operations coordinator and walked the second copy to Victoria Hale's mezzanine office herself, because some documents you don't send through the internal routing system. Victoria read it standing up. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and stood there for a moment with her hand flat on top of it. Not pressing down, just resting there, the way a person's hand rests on something they want to confirm is real. Outside the mezzanine window, the hangar floor was moving with the contained energy of a departure sequence finally authorized to proceed, and she watched it for a moment before she picked up the phone and called flight operations. "Move to final pre-departure sequence," she said. "I want wheels up by 1700. Then she came downstairs to find Adrian Cross. He was still in the alcove. He'd sent the full documentation package to Carmichael an hour earlier and had been doing the smaller, quieter work since, closing out diagnostic sessions, organizing the log records for federal evidence handover, preparing the system notes that would need to accompany the incident file. His laptop was closed. The canvas bag was packed. The legal pad, both sides covered entirely, margins and all, was tucked under his arm. He looked up when she appeared at the entrance, and something in the way he looked at her was different from the way he'd looked at her that morning, not warmer exactly, but less guarded in the way that people become less guarded when the thing they were braced for has already happened, and the aftermath turned out to be navigable. She sat in the straight chair near the door, not across from him at a formal angle, but slightly to the side, the way people sit when a conversation is necessary, but neither party wants it to feel like a proceeding. "The clearance came through," she said. "I know, Carmichael sent the confirmation. We're moving to final pre-departure, wheels up at 1700. She paused. I want to say something to you formally. The DoD contract liaison will receive a written statement from Skyforge identifying your role in detecting and resolving the system's compromise. That statement goes into the permanent contract record. Thank you. That's the formal part. She looked at him steadily. The less formal part is that I owe you a real apology, not a corporate one. This morning I made a choice about who to believe, and I made it for the wrong reasons. Nathan had been here 11 years, and you'd been here 11 weeks, and I treated duration as a substitute for evidence. She said it without patting it. That was arrogance, and it nearly put people in the air on a compromised aircraft. It did, Adrian said. Yes. She didn't qualify it. I'm sorry. I know you are. He picked up his pen, turned it once, set it down. The apology matters. But what happened this morning isn't going to be fixed by an apology. It's going to be fixed by what you build differently going forward. Your operations chief had administrative access to every classified system on that aircraft and credentials that nobody cross-checked against an independent baseline. That's not a Nathan Briggs problem. That's a structural problem. He could do what he did because the structure allowed it. Victoria listened without interrupting. Your maintenance log system accepts entries without verifying them against physical presence data. Your integration review process relies on the same person to authorize changes and audit them. Your access controls don't flag after-hours sessions on classified systems. He wasn't performing the critique, but he was laying it out the way he laid everything out, specifically because specificity was the only form of honesty he trusted. The sabotage worked as long as it did because Skyforge was built to trust people without the tools to detect when that trust was being abused. I've been thinking about all of that since 6 a.m., she said. Good. She held his gaze. I want to offer you something, and I want to be honest about what it is before you respond. I'm creating an independent safety and security operations function, reporting directly to me, outside the standard management chain, with federal oversight integration built in from the start. Full access to all classified system documentation. Authority to flag and halt any operation on safety grounds regardless of schedule or contract pressure. She paused. I want you to lead it. Adrian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the canvas bag on the equipment cart, the same bag he'd walked in with at 3:15 in the morning, before any of this was his problem. What does the reporting structure look like? Directly to me. No intermediate layer. And when I flag something and the schedule says it can't wait, the schedule waits. You said things like that this morning too, he said. You said Nathan's sign-off was sufficient. You said the aircraft had been certified. Words are not a structure. She absorbed that. What would a structure look like to you? He thought about it the way he thought about system architecture, not from the ideal, but from the failure modes. Written authority protocol. Any safety flag I issue requires dual confirmation from both the federal oversight contact and your outside legal counsel before it can be overridden. Not just your approval, a three-party verification process. The authority becomes procedural instead of personal, which means it survives personnel changes, including changes in you. Victoria paused at that last part. She hadn't expected him to build protections against her specifically. She sat with it for a moment, and the more she sat with it, the more it made the kind of sense that good structural thinking makes. Uncomfortable, because it's honest. Solid, because it doesn't depend on anyone staying good. That's a significant constraint on my own authority, she said. Yes, he said. That's the point. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the alcove, the hangar sounds had shifted into the higher, tighter register of a departure sequence building momentum. More voices, more movement, the hydraulic cycling of access systems running their final checks. I'll agree to that structure, she said, in writing, before you accept. I'll read the document first. She almost smiled. Not quite, but it was close, and it was real. Fair. She stood, straightened her jacket, the automatic reset of someone putting themselves back into forward motion. One more thing. She turned back from the doorway. When I walked out to find the security supervisor, oh, you could see what was coming, and you didn't argue. No. Why not? He looked at her. Because arguing with you wasn't going to fix the aircraft. The aircraft needed to be fixed. Arguing with you was your problem. I had mine. She stood there for a moment with that, and then she walked out. The written protocol arrived in Adrian's email 3 days later at 8:47 in the morning. 11 pages, drafted by outside counsel, structured more carefully than he'd anticipated. He read it front to back, twice. He made 4 notes where the language was ambiguous enough to create exploitable gaps. Not objections, adjustments. The kind of tightening that turns a document from a gesture into a mechanism. He emailed the notes to Patricia Osei. She responded within 2 hours. They went back and forth through the morning, and by early afternoon, the 4 places he'd flagged had been revised to his specifications. The final document was 14 pages. He read it one more time, linearly, without stopping. Then he typed 2 words in reply. I'll accept. He closed his laptop and went to make coffee, because the coffee in his apartment was better than anything that machine in the Skyforge break room had ever produced, and after the kind of day he'd had 3 days ago, better coffee felt like a legitimate priority. The things that happened in the weeks that followed didn't happen cleanly or quickly, because the situations that had been created over 14 months of careful planning didn't resolve themselves in the span of a press release or a federal filing. They resolved the way complicated things resolve, incrementally, through processes that moved at the pace of documentation and legal review, and the particular friction of institutional accountability being applied to people who had spent considerable energy constructing ways around it. Harlan Voss retained 4 lawyers within 48 hours of Carmichael's investigation, surfacing the financial structure underneath the sabotage. 4 lawyers is a specific number. Not 2, which is routine, and not 6, which signals panic. 4 is the number of someone who understands the severity of their situation and is calibrating their response to manage it rather than deny it. The Voss Group's acquisition vehicle was frozen by federal order pending financial review, which meant the $9 million Nathan Briggs had been promised existed now only as a number in a document that was evidence rather than an asset. Nathan cooperated. He cooperated in the specific, careful way of someone whose attorney has done the math and explained the difference between the first person to provide complete information and the second person to do so. He gave them Voss. He gave them the 14 months of planning, the approach, the financial arrangement, the communications. He gave them the board dinner on the 14th and the external VPN session from the parking structure of the Meridian Club and the name of the account the acquisition vehicle had been structured through. He gave them all of it with the flat procedural delivery of a man who has finished performing and is now just managing consequences. It was not enough to make him sympathetic. It was enough to matter legally, which was the only kind of mattering available to him at that point. Soren Hatch's situation took longer because it was genuinely more complicated, which is to say, it was complicated in the way that situations are complicated when a person did something wrong while being used to do it. And the wrongness and the being used existed at the same time, and neither one canceled the other out. The federal review found that he'd made the log modifications in good faith based on fraudulent authorization. That finding didn't eliminate his liability. He'd made changes to classified system records without independent verification, which was its own procedural failure regardless of what he'd been told. But it distinguished his role from Nathan's in ways that the subsequent HR process reflected. He returned to Skyforge 6 weeks later in a reduced capacity, with conditions on his access and a mandatory reporting structure that he had agreed to in writing. It was not the position he'd held for 8 years. He didn't expect it to be. What he had was work, and a clear understanding of exactly where he'd failed to push back when pushing back would have changed everything. And he carried that understanding not as punishment, but as information. The kind of information that either makes a person more careful or more rigid, and the difference between those two outcomes was the work he had to do in himself that no HR process could do for him. He showed up on his first day back and did his job carefully, and that was where it started. The formal statement Victoria had promised came before the written protocol. It went to the DoD contract liaison. It went into the permanent contract record. And it also, at Victoria's direction and without prior notice to Adrian, went to Skyforge's full contractor network in the form of a professional commendation letter that named him specifically and described his role in the incident with the kind of accuracy that formal documents rarely achieve because accuracy is usually sacrificed in favor of institutional self-protection. Victoria had decided not to sacrifice it. The decision cost her something. It made the morning's failure more visible, more documented, more on the record than a carefully worded incident report would have been. She made it anyway, because the alternative was continuing to be the kind of leader who managed appearances instead of facts, and she had spent enough of that morning understanding what that actually cost to be unwilling to return to it. Adrian read the commendation letter in his apartment on a Tuesday night. He read it the way he read everything, completely, specifically, looking for gaps between what was said and what was true. He didn't find any. He put his laptop down and sat with it for a minute and then went to bed, because he was tired and the letter was accurate, and those two things were all it needed to be. Ray Kowalski heard about Adrian's acceptance from Teo, who had stayed at the main facility while Ray was temporarily assigned to Skyforge's sister operation in Nevada. The text came through on a break. Contract tech is back, running the new safety function. Apparently gave them conditions before he said yes, and Ray read it, thought good, and put his phone away. He thought about it more that evening, sitting in the temporary housing the Nevada assignment came with, eating reheated takeout and watching nothing in particular on television. He thought about the morning of the departure, the aircraft on the staging platform, the security leads walking Nathan Briggs toward the conference room, the moment he'd stood near the fueling station and asked Adrian if the aircraft was going to fly, and Adrian had said yes, without hesitation, without performance. What Ray had understood in that moment, and what he continued to understand sitting in a temporary housing unit in Nevada with reheated takeout, was that the yes had not been confidence in the abstract. It had been specific. It had been the answer of a man who knew exactly what he'd done and what it had produced and what the machine he'd fixed was now capable of. There was no bravado in it. There wasn't even particular satisfaction. It was just accurate. Ray worked with a lot of people over the course of his career, and most of them were fine at their jobs, and some of them were good at their jobs, and a few of them were the kind of person who made the work itself more reliable just by being the one doing it. Adrian Cross was the last kind. Ray had identified that within the first week of the man being on site, and he'd been right about it. And the thing that had happened that morning had confirmed it in a way that most confirmations don't actually confirm, not by making the person look impressive, but by making the consequence of their presence concrete. The aircraft flew because Adrian Cross was there and refused to leave when leaving would have been easier. That was the whole story, really. Everything else was detail. The thing about Skyforge after that morning, the thing that took time to become visible but was real when it did, was that the change wasn't singular. It wasn't one policy or one reporting structure or one new hire in an oversight role. It was the kind of change that happens when an organization has been frightened badly enough by what its own gaps produced, and the people leading it have been honest enough with themselves about why the gaps existed. The maintenance log system was rebuilt with an independent verification layer that matched entry timestamps against physical access records. The access control framework was redesigned so that classified system modifications required dual authorization from separate credential sets that couldn't be administered by the same person. After-hours sessions on restricted systems triggered automatic alerts to the new safety function, which meant to Adrian, who kept the kind of hours that made after-hours a relative concept. These were not dramatic changes in the way that press releases about corporate transformation are dramatic. They were structural, quiet, and real, which was the only kind of change that mattered in an environment where the cost of a gap wasn't an embarrassing audit finding, but a compromised aircraft and a classified mission, and a man whose career was supposed to be ended for the crime of being right. Victoria didn't announce the changes with a company-wide speech. She implemented them through policy revision and operational procedure updates that went through the standard distribution channels with a cover note that was 2 sentences. These changes reflect gaps identified during the Condor 1 incident. They are effective immediately. That was it. No language about lessons learned, no framework for moving forward, no vision statement. Just the changes, implemented, in place. It was the most honest communication she'd sent to her organization in 2 years, and several people noticed that without being able to articulate exactly why. Adrian's first week in the new role was not the week of revelation and reorganization that some part of him had anticipated and another part had been quietly wary of. It was administrative, which was the accurate version of a new job's first week when the new job involves inheriting a system that needs to be understood before it can be improved. He read documentation. He reviewed access logs. He had 7 meetings, 5 of which were introduction meetings, and 2 of which were substantive, and the substantive ones were with Marcy Velt and with the DoD Contract Liaison's technical representative, whose name was Brendan Walsh, and who turned out to be the kind of federal contact who preferred direct communication over process language, which made him immediately useful. Marcy was the person who told him, on Wednesday of that first week, that the floor crew had started referring to him by a shorthand that she delivered with the flat neutrality of someone reporting a fact rather than endorsing an interpretation. "What shorthand?" Adrian asked. "The guy who didn't leave," she said. He looked at her. "That's not very efficient." "It's accurate, though." He went back to the access log he was reviewing, and she went back to her terminal, and neither of them said anything else about it, because neither of them needed to. The guy who didn't leave. It wasn't a compliment in the conventional sense. It wasn't about skill or expertise or the particular combination of knowledge and nerve that had kept him at a diagnostic terminal for 10 hours in circumstances designed to make him feel like he had no authority to be there. It was about something simpler and harder to manufacture than any of those things. It was about the decision to stay when the person with the most power in the building told you to go, not out of defiance, not out of ego, but because the problem was real and leaving it unfixed was not something you were capable of treating as acceptable. There's a version of that story where Adrian Cross is the hero of it in the clean, uncomplicated sense, where he knew from the beginning that he was right and they were wrong, and he stood firm and was vindicated. That version is not the true one. The true version is that he was tired and working on bad coffee and genuinely uncertain for a portion of the early morning whether the anomaly he'd found was significant enough to justify the conflict it was going to create. He'd had the thought that he might be wrong. He'd had the thought that Nathan Briggs was the operations chief for a reason, and maybe the baseline documentation he was trusting was the thing that was outdated rather than the current configuration. He'd had the thought, briefly, at 5:20 in the morning when the security supervisor was walking him toward the side door, that maybe the right move was to file the concern through proper channels and let someone else decide. He hadn't done any of those things. Not because he was certain he was right in that heroic, unshakable way, but because the diagnostic data was specific enough that uncertainty was not a legitimate reason to stop. You don't need to be sure you're right to refuse to stop being thorough. You just need to be sure the evidence hasn't been fully examined. That distinction mattered. It was the difference between confidence and discipline. And confidence was a feeling that came and went depending on the morning, but discipline was a practice that had nothing to do with how you felt. Condor 1 returned from its mission 22 days after departure. The arrival was not a public event. Classified operations don't have arrival ceremonies. But the flight operations coordinator sent a brief confirmation through the DoD liaison channel, and Adrian received it as a one-line message while he was reviewing the revised access control framework at his desk. Condor 1, RTB. Mission complete. RTB, return to base. 2 words that meant everything it needed to mean. He read it twice. Then he closed the message and went back to the framework document, because the framework document was what was in front of him, and the work in front of you was the work that mattered. Victoria saw the same message forwarded from the liaison. She was in a financial review meeting, the first of several related to the Voss Group investigation and its implications for Skyforge's investment relationships, when it came through on her phone. She looked at it under the table with the meeting continuing around her, and something in her chest released that had been held since the morning she'd watched the aircraft taxi out of the hangar and disappear in the direction of the runway. She put her phone face down and returned to the meeting. The mission had completed. The aircraft had come back. The people on it had gone up in something airworthy and come back down again, which was the whole point of every certification and every check and every argument about whether a diagnostic anomaly was significant enough to ground a flight on the morning of a classified government operation. It was the whole point. Sometimes the whole point is just that simple. There is something that gets lost in the telling of stories like this one. something that the narrative structure of exposure and vindication tends to obscure. It's this. The version of the morning where nobody catches the sabotage is not hard to imagine. It requires only slightly different circumstances. Adrian Cross assigned to a different shift, or Nathan Briggs choosing a slightly deeper layer of the system for the parameter change, or Victoria Hale's assistant deciding not to come back a second time after being told to send the contractor through proper channels. Any one of those things, and the story becomes different. Not a story about a man who found the problem, but a story about what happens when a problem finds the aircraft first. That version of the morning exists somewhere in the space of what could have happened. It is close enough to be uncomfortable and far enough to be survivable, and the distance between them is not primarily the skill of one man with a diagnostic terminal, though that was real. It is also the distance created by every individual decision that morning. Marcy handing over the cable without questioning it, Soren showing up to the alcove instead of waiting to see what happened, Ray Kowalski asking a direct question instead of a polite one, the federal oversight contact who answered a call from a number he hadn't heard from in 4 years at 5 in the morning without sending it to voicemail. None of those people were perfect. None of them operated without fear or without calculation. Soren had made a serious error and was managing the aftermath. Marcy had signed certifications on a system that had been compromised without her knowledge and lived with the discomfort of that for weeks. Victoria had made the most consequential wrong call of her professional life in front of her entire company and was still in the process of understanding all that it meant about her. Ray was a fueling technician in Nevada who would probably never think about this particular morning as the kind of thing that gets remembered, but who had stood in front of the aircraft that morning and done his job with the care of someone who understood in his body what it meant for that care to matter. People who do honest work without recognition are not a type. They are not born knowing they are that kind of person. They find out through the accumulation of specific decisions made in specific moments when the easier choice was available and they took the harder one anyway, usually without drama, usually without anyone watching, usually because the alternative was to be a different person than they'd decided to be. Adrian Cross had been making that decision since before Skyforge existed. He would keep making it in the weeks and months that followed, in an office that looked down at a hangar floor, reviewing access logs and revised protocols, and the slow, unglamorous work of making a system more honest than it was. It was not a story about a hero. It was a story about what happens when the right person stays in the room and what that costs them, and what it costs everyone when there is no one in the room willing to do it. The aircraft came back. The mission completed. The work continued. And in a hangar that no longer ran on the assumption that authority was the same thing as accuracy, the lights burned the way they always burned, at full capacity, without ceremony, doing the only thing lights know how to do, which is make it possible to see what's actually there,